Now, we've got the shell. The shell is protected. Let's talk about the work area configuration. This really comes down to how much money do you have to make this work. Your workstations, you're going to have two different kinds of workstations, a research workstation and an imaging workstation. Research workstations are usually connected to the outside world. Imaging workstations are not. You may have a third workstation that is used for actually processing and dealing with password cracking in some instances, and that may be connected to several GPUs. Remember, you're going to be bringing in outside equipment. So if you've got a desk with a computer and a mouse and another computer and a mouse here, and you've got this all laid out just for you, you're going to have to push all this stuff aside and put down the evidence in front of you. So make sure that you design your lab so that you actually have that open working space. It should be well planned and it should be scalable for the purpose. One of the things that we ask is, how much evidence do you think we're going to be processing in this particular lab? Now, what usually happens is we do a lab ad hoc in an organization. We're not talking about criminal investigations. We're not talking about law enforcement. We're talking about corporate here. And when we set these things up, somebody says, we really need incident handling. Okay, we got a help desk. We're going to upgrade that to incident handling. We really need a forensics investigation unit. Okay, well, can you do the forensics investigation right here in the lab that you're already working on? We're going to repurpose you. Well, I need a little bit of extra space. Okay, well, we'll tear out that closet and we'll go ahead and we'll put you in that closet over there. How's that doing? And then we process more cases and they find out that it's more and more valuable. Then eventually what happens is, just like every other business process, we get stretched to our absolute limits. We get to that breaking point and then we say, okay, well, we need a lot more space. Management says you can't have a lot more space, but you can have a little more space. As their requirements go up, the size of the lab should actually grow. It should be well planned and scalable. Most of the time, it's not. You should have workstations, UPS, book racks, and all the necessary software in your lab. Let's talk about each one of those. You should also have reference materials, a safe locker, and a storage locker. I say Pelican cases at a minimum with 2 locks on them, not just one. If you're really uber paranoid, you have one lock with one key held by one person, and you have another lock with another key held by a different person, so that it takes 2 people to get this particular case open or gets a particular door open. If inside of your particular lab you actually have a wire cage that is wired on all 6 sides, because remember it's a cube, not just 4 sides, it's all wired on all 4. You may even put 2 keys for 2 different locks on that. I think that's the best practice, but that's also not a cheap practice, so you've got to be ready for it. Make sure that your LAN and internet connectivity is safe and you can turn it on and off. And if you need to do backups, you need tape drives. You should also have additional hard drives that have been wiped and referenced correctly. We'll talk about wiping in a little bit. You should have the cabinets to store all this stuff, the printers and the scanners that you need. I'd say photographic equipment is a really good idea. We can use digital cameras today, but just make sure that they're massive megapixels. I think 7 megapixels is probably like the bare minimum. Somebody else is going to tell you something different out there, but my information may be a little bit dated at this point. You need an evidence locker, and you need a forensics archive and a place to restore a robotic device to go ahead and store massive amounts of data. The evidence locker, let's dig into that for a second here. It's in that restricted area that's only allowed by lab personnel, so usually you put it inside of your lab and you have key carding on the outside of the door and you have key locks on that evidence locker itself. It's always locked when not in use, and it's always monitored CCTV and capturing all the data across that for all the cases that are possibly being monitored. Usually what you do is you put CCTV in this location and then you send that feed to your remote guard station as a separate feed for all the communications, for all the remote monitoring. Make sure that you've got good storage containers and cabinets that are made of steel, that deal with magnetism well, that aren't magnetized themselves. Limit the number of keys that you have. Let's talk about this. This is a weird topic to say. Forensics robotic devices, what does that mean? It's a really high-speed disk duplication machine for optical media. So what you have is you have a big stack of DVDs or Blu-rays on a spindle, and they're all clean write once media. And then you also have a labeler that's associated with it. You say, okay, I've got 5 gigs of data here that I need to archive for a long period of time because we're processing cases and we might not be called to court for 2 or 3 years at the max. I mean, it's probably a lot shorter than that. Okay, so how am I going to store this information so that I can retrieve it in a reasonable way and not worry about magnetic failures? And that's when you get this robotic device that actually picks them up, burns the disk, and you can go ahead and load it with all the data, and then it'll pop out all that set of disks that you can then use. You could give those disks to the opposing counsel if you wanted to, if they feel comfortable with that, or you can say, hey, supply me with a forensically sound drive. I'm going to wipe it in my lab, and then I'm going to take a copy from the reference set, not from the original. Remember, the original gets pulled. It gets 2 copies pulled at the very beginning, and it gets sealed away and put away. And unless by court order you're required to open up that evidence, don't do it. And if you're going to give it to another forensics expert, make sure that you validate their credentials and that you have something in writing from the opposing counsel and them and proving that they are who they say they are. You don't want this information to leak out. This data that you created on these DVDs also needs a printed label on it, disc 1 of 372. I mean, you're going to have to process that in your lab, and you're going to have the supplies to actually make that happen. Hardware. Write blockers, disk duplication, and mobile power. We've already talked about write blockers before. Disk duplication, usually we want to do that in a physical disk duplicator, not a software disk duplicator. And when it comes to mobile power, remember you need that for your laptops and also for laptops that you may be retrieving from suspects.